The leaders of NATO's newest members, Sweden and Finland, have arrived in Washington for the bloc summit getting underway today. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson and the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, arrived at a military airbase just outside of the U.S. capital. Both countries joined the alliance after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Ensuring Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself against Russia will be top of the agenda at the summit. NATO has been discussing the prospect of Ukrainian membership for years. However, it's not expected to be discussed at this summit.
NATO countries have said they'll support Ukraine as long as it takes in its fight against Russian aggression, which NATO has described as an existential threat. Russian President Vladimir Putin, for his part, sees NATO's eastward expansion to his country's borders as a justification for his war on Ukraine. Following Moscow's first illegal land grab of Crimea in 2014, Kyiv sought to join the Western military alliance for greater protection. NATO countries have said Ukraine will eventually become a member. But at last year's summit in Vilnius, the alliance refused to commit to a timeline, a huge disappointment for President Volodymyr Zelensky. This year, the alliance is trying to better manage expectations for Kyiv. The focus is on what's being called building a bridge to the future.
We will agree to work more closely with the Ukrainian armed forces, including at the new NATO-Ukraine Joint Analysis, Training and Education Center in Poland. We will also work together to build Ukraine's defense industry and deepen our cooperation on innovation. All the work we are doing together is making Ukraine stronger, more interoperable and better prepared than ever to join our alliance.
In the meantime, Zelensky has been securing bilateral defense agreements with a number of individual NATO member countries. In May, several European partners pledged more aid, including F-16 fighter jets. Ukraine has also asked for more help with its air defenses, including Patriot missile systems. With NATO membership not likely in the immediate future, Ukraine continues to push for bilateral assurances, most recently from neighboring Poland, one of Kyiv's most vocal allies. Still, Zelensky hopes for more aid from NATO.
I expect very concrete answers and steps from our partners at the NATO summit. We'll have a meeting dedicated to reinforcing Ukraine's air defenses, to our civilian infrastructure, water supplies, and the energy grid. I expect concrete steps.
NATO members last week stopped short of backing Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's request for a multi-year funding package for Ukraine. The recent budget battle in the U.S. also underscored the limits to leaders' official pledges, with Ukraine aid increasingly becoming instrumentalized in domestic political battles.
DW's Washington Bureau Chief Ines Pohl is at the summit, and she told us more about what NATO leaders aim to accomplish as they meet in the U.S. Capitol.
Right, Nicole, we're here in Washington where NATO was founded 75 years ago. So this is actually also a birthday party, if you wish, this 75th NATO summit here in the capital of the United States. But of course, they're not only looking backwards and celebrate the strength they gained over the years and the 32 members. Never have there been so many member states at NATO. This summit is also taking place in a moment with many uncertainties. You just talked about Ukraine, but it's not only Ukraine which is discussed here. It's also how NATO can face the challenges from China. So the South Pacific strategy will also play a major role here, and head of states from Japan, for example, or New Zealand and Australia also here to discuss how NATO, how the alliance can deepen their partnerships with countries from the South Pacific. And I just want to use this chance to recommend our viewers to turn on our DW YouTube channel and watch our documentary, which is giving us a little bit of a deeper insight about this South Pacific strategy.
All right, let's hope they stick with us for as long as the show runs, at least. Ines, you say Ukraine is not the only topic on the agenda, but it is front and center, and not all NATO members agree on how to support Kyiv. The presidential election in the U.S. is creating even more uncertainty in that regard. So how are these challenges going to be addressed at the summit?
Yeah, that's definitely the big elephant here in the room. What happens if Donald Trump will be re-elected on November 5th when the presidential elections are taking place here, especially now with the huge debate about the current president, President Joe Biden, who is a strong supporter of Ukraine from day one on. But what if Trump comes back to the White House? As we all know, he already threatened to leave NATO during his last presidency. So it will all come down to the question of burden sharing. Many, especially Eastern European countries, want the member states to pay 3% of a GDP instead only 2% what they're doing now. So we will watch that very closely and report closely about these issues, how much money which country wants to spend, and of course how much or how different countries support Ukraine's way into a full membership of the alliance. These are major topics which will be discussed the following days.
That was our Washington Bureau Chief Ines Pohl speaking to us there live from the NATO summit. Thank you so much. Well, let's look at the Russian side. Joining us now from Riga is our former Moscow Bureau Chief, Juri Rescheto. He's reported from Latvia since authorities shut down DW's bureau in Russia. Juri, good to see you. Now, how does the Kremlin view this NATO summit?
Well, Nicole, for the Kremlin, NATO is pretty much, I would say, enemy number one. And that is why NATO's 75th anniversary celebrations are a thorn in the Kremlin's side, especially considering that NATO is celebrating, we've heard it, its 75-year history as a success. Moscow sees its war against Ukraine, by the way, as a war that NATO is allegedly fighting against Russia. That's what Russian state propaganda claims. The Russians argue that NATO states are supplying Ukraine with weapons, training Ukrainian soldiers and supporting Kyiv with money. So that means that from the Russian point of view, NATO states are at war with Russia. At the same time, President Putin claimed a few weeks ago that Russia was not crazy enough to want to actually go to war with NATO directly.
Now, since Finland and Sweden joined, the alliance is even bigger and right on Russia's border. Now, what do you expect Putin to do in response to something he so eagerly wanted to prevent, an expansion of NATO?
You're right. Russia has already indicated that it will, for example, move its troops directly to the Finnish border. Since Finland joined NATO last year, you said it, that means that they are moving troops to the new NATO border with Russia, which is extremely long, almost 1,300 kilometers. And it's unprotected, this border, on both sides. Now Finland wants to change that and build a wall. The Baltic countries, by the way, of Latvia and Lithuania, where I'm right now, are already doing that. Also, they are building a border fence with Russia. And of course, Russia is also stepping up its rhetoric. From time to time, there is talk of nuclear weapons being stationed in Kaliningrad, for example, the Russian enclave in the Baltic Sea. The Russians also want to station Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus, in neighboring Belarus, or may even have already stationed some of them there. But here too, Moscow places the blame on the West by saying that it's the NATO states that are threatening Russia with nuclear weapons, and Russia is only responding.
That was DW's Juri Rescheto joining us from Riga. Thank you so much.
And for more, we can talk now to Chris Chivvis. He's a senior fellow and director of the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace think tank. That's in Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW, Chris. Thanks so much for your time today. Now, we know NATO is committed to supporting Ukraine, but how easy will it be to stick to this commitment over the long term, though, given that certain member states aren't so keen on supporting Ukraine as others might be?
Yeah, I think it's a question that's got to be on everyone's minds, both here in Washington and, of course, in Kyiv. There are two big challenges that the alliance faces right now in supporting Ukraine. The first is what you alluded to, which is the political unity within the alliance, which was very strong at the start of the war in the face of this brutal Russian aggression, has become less strong over the course of the last 2.5 years. And I think as some experts and officials and political leaders look towards 2025, they're beginning to wonder, what can we do to try to bring this disastrous war to an end? I mean, you were showing footage earlier of the horrible strike that took place on that hospital in Ukraine. And we don't want to be seeing these things a year from now. So I think that there is a growing sentiment that something needs to be done to bring this war to an end. And of course, there are going to be some countries that want to do more to support Ukraine than others. And I expect to see those divisions grow over the course of the next year. Of course, there are also real issues about what kind of assistance is available, what kind of military assistance is actually available. NATO militaries and industry are very strained to provide the kinds of weapons that Ukraine needs, and whether or not they can do it indefinitely is something that is really a real question that we need to take seriously.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there's supporting Ukraine and then there's offering Ukraine membership. Now, you've said yourself that admitting Ukraine to NATO would be a mistake for both Ukraine and the alliance. Tell us why you said that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think certainly under current conditions it would be a mistake, and at any time in the near future it would be a mistake. There are three basic reasons why it doesn't seem to make sense to me. I mean, the first is that if we're going to be realistic about this, bringing Ukraine into NATO imports a gigantic vulnerability into the alliance. Ukraine has got 300,000 men under arms fighting Russia right now. Those men are going to need to be reintegrated into the Ukrainian economy once the war is over, if the Ukrainian economy is going to have any hope of taking off. And so who's going to fill that gap? That gap is going to have to come from European countries or from the United States, none of whom have, or very few of whom at least, have demonstrated much of an interest in putting large numbers of forces into Ukraine now, and why they would do that in the future. I doubt that they would. And so as a result, we risk being in a situation where we've made an Article 5 commitment to Ukraine. In other words, a commitment to come to its defense as an alliance, but we're not really ready to fulfill that. And that seems like a huge liability to me.
So how can NATO effectively support Ukraine now without escalating the war further?
Well, I think obviously a lot of the steps that have been taken to try to provide Ukraine with some kind of meaningful defense against further Russian advances are important, and it's important that they continue. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about what we tell Ukraine is going to happen over the medium and the long term. And I fear sometimes that we have promised more to Ukraine, both implicitly and explicitly, than the alliance is going to be ready to deliver. As far as I can tell, there is still, in theory, a support within the alliance for Ukraine retaking all of its territory, but this just isn't a realistic war aim, and so we need to get real about that and start taking the possibility of some kind of a ceasefire, probably that involves negotiations that no one wants to undertake with the brutal regime in Moscow. But that seems like the only way to get this war to an end and to get terrible things like the bombing that we saw yesterday to stop.
Can I ask you how domestic political battles in the US might influence NATO's support for Ukraine?
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that if Donald Trump should be elected president this fall, that he's going to take a different approach to Ukraine than the approach that the Biden administration has taken. The question is, how different is that approach going to be? And I think there have been a number of different ideas that are put out there, but I would say that it probably, under a Trump administration, the approach to Ukraine would range between withdrawing, precipitous withdrawal of U.S. support, which would be very difficult for European allies to fill in, and some kind of an effort to bring about a negotiated settlement, potentially even with even by increasing pressure on Russia, for example, by allowing Ukraine to strike more deeply into Russian territories. We don't know exactly what a Trump policy on Ukraine would look like, but it's certain to be different from the unconditional support that the Biden administration has provided Ukraine, and that's sure to create massive divisions and difficulties within NATO.
Chris Chivvis, Director of the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment. Thank you so much for your time, Chris. We appreciate it.